All right, guys, so we are going to move into Chapter 7, Lesson 2 of our Social Studies textbook. Those are pages 286 to 293 if you're following along. Regardless, you're going to read those pages tomorrow, just like we did last week. So let's see. Last week we talked about how the Pony Express, the Overland Mail, and the telegraph all work together to transform communication between the East Coast and the West Coast. So that was a huge improvement and made it easier for California and the federal government in Washington, D.C. to communicate. However, there was still a problem of travel between the East and the West. So communication, fast. Travel, my big head's in the way. Put myself up here. Travel was still slow. So how are we going to fix that? So there's an idea that America should create something called a transcontinental railroad. So the word transcontinental means it goes across the continents from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and back again, right? That would help bring America even closer together if people were able to make that trip in a lot more quickly than using a covered wagon or using a ship to sail all the way around Panama or even the tip of South America. So, I mean, railroads existed, but a transcontinental railroad did not. So, not one that traveled across the entire continent. So, from Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. So, this was a very popular idea. People liked this idea for a couple of reasons, right? The first reason being that says travel. Sorry, my L got bumped down. But obviously, for travel reasons, right? If I wanted to go to California, I did not want to take like this 6 or 4 months journey all the way there in a covered wagon or on some stinky ship where I would get seasick. And yeah, sounds horrible, right? Not a tempting trip to make. And another reason is for trade. So California, we know, has a lot of agriculture, a lot of great land. So there are people growing things in California like cabbage and lettuce, and they want to be able to send that back east. California has a great climate for growing things like that. Also, goods from Asia. So, I mean, if you think about California and Asia, they're a lot closer together than the East Coast, where you would have to go all the way around the tip of Africa to reach Asia or across land. California, you just sail across the Pacific from Asia, and then you could use a transcontinental railroad to ship those goods from Asia back east. So that would be a lot simpler too, wouldn't it? So this dude named Theodore Judah, very handsome, dashing man. He is an engineer. So not the kind of engineer that like drives the trains. I know that's like a word that has more than one meaning. He's the kind of engineer that builds things and plans things out. But what he liked to build and plan out were train tracks and train routes, right? So he kind of took this idea of the Transcontinental Railroad, and he was kind of like very committed to this idea. He knew that in California, the hardest part of building this railroad would be getting it through the Sierra Nevada mountains. That was like one of the hardest parts of a land journey with a covered wagon or on horse. So, of course, getting a train through there, really, really hard to do. He actually went to the Sierra Nevada mountains 23 times, trying and just explored all over, trying to find a route to get through there before he kind of said, okay, this is the way we should go. He has this quote. It says, "It is the most magnificent project ever conceived." It being referring to the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad. So he was pretty jazzed up about this idea, right? So Transcontinental Railroad, who is going to give you money to build this thing, right? The federal government, I mean, they liked this idea too, and they were willing to put some money in, but this was going to be a pretty expensive creation, like millions of dollars, and millions of dollars at that time was a lot of money. I mean, millions of dollars now is a lot of money, but at that time, even more. So he needed some investors. So he needed people to invest in his awesome railroad idea. Investors are people that give money to a business or an idea with the idea that once this business is up and running and it's making money, they'll be given back their investment and in addition to lots of other money in return. So investors are hoping to make money by providing money to start something up. So he did find investors. He found these 4 men: Charles Crocker, Mark Hopkins, Collis P. Huntington, and Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford, yes, he is the Stanford College dude. These guys were known as the Big Four. They were rich. They gave money to help create this railroad. Without their contribution, it was not going to happen. So they formed the Central Pacific Railroad Company. Now, there was also another railroad company that existed at this time called the Union Pacific. So we've got the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad companies. So, like any other companies that existed in the same market, they're kind of, they would kind of work together, but also they were kind of competitors, right? Congress passed in 1862 something called the Pacific Railroad Act. And that was the idea that the Central Pacific was in charge of starting in Sacramento and building east. And the Union Pacific was starting in the east, or not all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, because there was actually already trains running in the East Coast. So basically their starting point was going to be Iowa. And you could look at a map of where Iowa is in your social studies book, but it's about in the middle. And their job was to build west from Iowa. And the idea was that they'd meet in the middle, right? During this time, 1862, when this act was passed, the Civil War was happening. So the United States was at war with itself. That was the war between the North and the South states in the United States. So a lot of people were fighting this war, so they didn't have a lot of railroad workers, people that were not fighting, that were able to come and help them build this railroad. So that was kind of a problem, and that made them begin working on the railroad really, really slowly. The Union Pacific Railroad, they got a lot of immigrants from Ireland to come and build for them. And when the war finally ended in 1865, most soldiers, former soldiers, would go and work for the Union Pacific because, I mean, that's where most soldiers were from, that side, because we didn't have not many were from California. So it was more convenient for them to start in Iowa, right? The Central Pacific made use of immigrants from China because, like we said about how Asia and California are a lot closer together. Well, there was a lot of Chinese immigrants that came to California from the gold rush as entrepreneurs and as prospectors. So they had a big workforce there. In addition, the Central Pacific Railroad soon discovered that these Chinese immigrant workers were really hard workers and really good workers. So they started to bring workers from China just for the purpose of building the railroad. In fact, I know in the book it said that there were at one year more than 12,000 workers from China working on the Central Pacific Railroad, regardless of them making actually less money than the other workers. So if you were from China, you would make less money, and you would have the most dangerous jobs. It doesn't seem very fair, but that's the history of the world, right? So to complete the railroad, remember Theodore Judas said that the hardest part of this railroad was going to be going through the Sierra Nevada mountains. So they had to make tunnels through the solid rock of the Sierra Nevada. It made more sense to create tunnels than to go straight up the side of a mountain, which a train couldn't do, right? We had to kind of meander around, gradually increasing the slope. So they ended up cutting 15 tunnels through solid rock of the Sierra Nevada mountains, they being the workers. These were difficult, dangerous jobs, right? So John Henry, remember John Henry? he had his iron rod that he would drive into the side of the mountain. Then they would stuff that hole that they created with dynamite. And usually it was a Chinese worker that was in charge of that. Light it on fire, blow it apart into little pieces of rock. Then they'd have to clear all those little pieces of rock out of there. And then once they finally got it cleared, then they'd have to actually lay down the track, which involved a lot of hammering of railroad spikes to keep. So I know if you've ever seen a railroad track up close, they've got these wooden slats going across, and then you have the rails, and each of these slats has to be hammered down with spikes to hold them in place, right? So all of that was slow going in the Sierra Nevada mountains. The book says that there were some parts where while they were building the tracks in the mountains, they would go like only a few inches in one day because they were trying to get through this rock and trying to create these tunnels. So that's very slow moving, right? So the US government recognized, hey, you know what, this is a great idea, but like what's taking so long, right? So they tried to incentivize or like motivate the workers and the companies to go faster. So they decided to kind of pay the Union Pacific and the Railroad Pacific companies money for how much track they laid. So it was kind of like a competition, right? So they Central Pacific Company wanted to lay lots of track and get lots of money from the government, but so did Union Pacific. So they're like racing towards each other because remember they're trying to meet in the middle, and whoever put the most track down would get the most money, right? So it did take 6 years to finally finish the Transcontinental Railroad. So they finished on May 10th, 1869. They started in 1863. And they met in the middle at Promontory, Utah. That's this place in Utah that is still famous for being the location of what we call the Golden Spike. So you know all those spikes that were hammered into the ground to hold the tracks in place? Well, they saved one spot for the final spike connecting these two tracks that met together here. And this spike was made out of solid gold, hence its name, the Golden Spike. And the Golden Spike is also engraved with a message. The message is, may God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world. So remember, this is following the Civil War, so where America had been at war with itself. And so this idea of unity within the country was a really important idea. And this transcontinental railroad was a really important idea for that unity and that connection. So if you wanted to travel on the railroad at this time and you wanted to be in one of those fancy, comfy cars, it would cost you about $100. If you didn't have $100, you could pay $40 and you could sit on a bench. The trip took, I mean, it wasn't like overnight, right? It was still took a week, but that is so much faster than months and months of travel, right? So the idea of getting to California in a week from the Atlantic Ocean, like amazing. However, if you didn't have a lot of money, you'd have to pay and spend that week on a bench, which wasn't the most comfortable, I'm sure. But hey, a week on a bench better than months in a covered wagon, in my opinion. What is the equivalent of $40 today? Because $40 now would be like, really, that's it? Okay, I'll give you $40. But a long time, or at that time in 1869, $40 was the equivalent of about $536. So not as cheap as it sounds, but in addition to being shorter than a trip on a covered wagon, it was probably less expensive in the long run because you had to buy less supplies and all that. So that is the condensed, quick, and dirty version of the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. A huge success. Still so many books talked about today. Unfortunately, we were going to go to in Sacramento this amazing museum all about this railroad creation. I highly recommend that one day you do that because it is a really cool museum. I know, but it really is. Trust me. If you've never been to the Railroad Museum in Sacramento, I recommend it. It's pretty cool. And now that you know about the Transcontinental Railroad and its importance, it would be even more meaningful. I want to talk about this man that we have on the final page, or the page after. You know, we always have those biographies. So the biography there is about a man named Yi Feng Chung. He is a man from China. He immigrated to California. Before going to California, he was an herbalist back in China. An herbalist is someone who uses herbs to treat illnesses, herbs being like spices, plants, and things like that. So, if you got sick, he would make a mixture of different herbs to help make you feel better or heal you. So, when he first immigrated to California in 1850, he came as a prospector. So, he wanted to find gold. Like many people, many prospectors at that time, though, he soon discovered that finding gold was not as easy as he thought. So, he decided instead to become an entrepreneur using his knowledge of herbal medicine. So he actually started a herb shop in Fiddletown, which is a mining camp near Sacramento, and he actually was very, very successful. And a lot of people came to him because, you know, there's not a lot of doctors around at this time. Everybody's there looking for gold or selling things, right? So if you got sick, there you didn't have a lot of choices, right? So he became popular and successful. So he started to open more and more shops. So he opened shops throughout California and Nevada and became pretty rich. It wasn't so much that he made a lot of money that makes him famous. It's that he saved a lot of lives. One of the most famous lives he saved was Governor Leland Stanford's wife. So remember Leland Stanford? He was one of the big four. He also later became the governor of California. So remember, a governor is kind of like a president of the state, where he's kind of in charge of how the state is run and things like that. And he interacts with the president of the United States, and they kind of work together to make the state successful. So his wife, who had already been really into herbal medicine to begin with, got sick, and he gave her herbs, and she got better. So people were really impressed with him and his medicine and his medicinal abilities. So I think one of the reasons why he's talked about is because as a result of the gold rush and the creation of the railroad, there was a lot of immigration from China to California. Um, Later on, we'll read a little bit more about how Chinese were treated during this time. We've already read about how during the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese immigrants were paid less by the companies, and they had the most dangerous jobs. So we already know there's some inequity there, and we'll continue to read that more about that in the future. So I hope you guys enjoy learning about the Transcontinental Railroad. Tomorrow, you're going to read those pages in the book. Now, I know you just listened to me kind of give you a rundown of everything, but it would definitely benefit you to practice reading those pages, because one of our reading skills is being able to read a textbook and pull out information. And hopefully, with my little preview, it's a little bit easier for you to read the book and understand what's happening. All right, so go do that and enjoy.